everyone to join. I see people joining. Then we are ready to start. Good afternoon or good morning, whenever you are. My name is Chris Rallis, and on behalf of the CFC Secretariat, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining in this important event for the CFC. In a world marked by unprecedented economic progress, technological advancement, and abundant financial resources, the Secretariat CFC deeply believes that it is unjust that millions of people continue to live in extreme poverty. The compounded effects of ongoing global crises, commodity scarcity and rising inflation have only pushed more vulnerable communities into hardship, widening the gap between prosperity and poverty. The International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, observed each year on October 17th, finds its root in a very important meeting held back in 1987 in Paris. And during that meeting, people came together to declare poverty a violation on human rights, a call that continues to resonate strongly today. Since then, individuals and communities around the world have united annually to express solidarity with those living in poverty and to reaffirm their commitment to dignity and justice for all. This year's theme, Economic Justice for Smallholders, Rethinking Poverty Through Structural Transformation, invite us to look deeper at the systemic barriers that perpetuate inequality. It challenges us to rethink how economic structures can be reshaped to empower smallholder farmers and vulnerable communities, which are the backbone of many of our commodity value chains. It is with much pleasure that we welcome Dr. Andrew Fischer, Professor of Inequality, Social Protection and Development at the International Institute of Social Studies, ISS, as our keynote speaker today. The discussion today will help us reflect how our work at the grassroots of commodity value chains could contribute more to poverty eradication and alleviation. Now, I'm honored to introduce our Managing Director, His Excellency Ambassador Sheikh Mohammed Belal. And as you know, at the CFC, we're continuously seeking effective ways to create lasting structural transformation that enables smallholder farmers to thrive. This includes supporting innovations that strengthen their position in the value chain, give them the tools to increase their income, and unlock new economic opportunities. We believe that commodity value chains holds immense potential to drive inclusive growth and help farmers overcome systemic barriers to prosperity. Ambassador Beral, Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Professor Andrew Martin Fischer, Excellencies, dear colleagues, Team CFC, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm coming through okay. Let me begin by recalling a moment that is still echoes across generation. At the World Food Conference in Rome in 1974, a global food crisis was going on at that time, and much renowned the Secretary of State of the United States at that time, the great philosopher Henry Kissinger, he announced, I quote, "Today we must proclaim a bold objective that within a decade, I repeat, within a decade, no child will go to bed hungry, that no family will fear for its next day's bread, and that no human being's future and capacities will be stunted by malnutrition," unquote. That was 51 years ago. Humanity already possessed the means, the knowledge, and at least in words, the will to end hunger within a decade. Yet, here we are in 2025, still confronting a world where more than 735 million people go hungry every day, more than the entire population of the European Union and United States combined together. That is equivalent to 40 Netherlands going hungry at the same time. Just last week, at the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, the Brazilian President Honorable Lula de Silva, reminded us that 9% of humanity still lives in absolute poverty. If you convert this 9% to today's population, that's 735 million people who are going hungry. And what is absolute poverty? It is when the struggle is not for a better life, but for the life itself. When a farmer must choose between feeding the family or saving seeds for the next season. When a mother decides which meal her children can skip. When a child's future is dimmed not by lack of talent, but by lack of light to study under. It is leaving one illness away from ruin, one drought away from hunger, one market fluctuation away from despair. Absolute poverty is not a number. It is the daily negotiation between survival and dignity. And most of those living in this reality are smallholders and commodity producers, the very people who feed and clothe us. They are the invisible foundation of our prosperity. Those who grew our coffee, harvest our cocoa, spin our cotton, yet remain unseen and underpaid. Poverty today is not born of scarcity. It is sustained by structure. The global economy depends on cheap labor, cheap commodities, and cheap nature. Smallholders are not failing. The system is failing them. This is precisely where our keynote speaker, Professor Andrew Martin Fischer, has offered some of the most profound insights of our time. In his award-winning book, Poverty as Ideology, Professor Fischer shows that poverty is not an accident of geography or mismanagement. It is a design feature of an unequal global order. It is created, reproduced, and normalized through systems of trade, finance, policy that privilege extraction over equity. The evidence is sobering. As Jackson Hickel and colleagues have demonstrated, the global south loses an estimated US dollar 2.2 trillion every year through unequal exchange, value drained via unfair pricing of labor and resources, enough to end extreme poverty 15 times over. And according to the Financial Times, a coffee farmer earns just one penny from a $2.50 British pound a cup, while most of the profit is captured by roasters and retailers. The injustice is not hidden. It is embodied in every sip we take. These are the very structures that Professor Fischer will help us peel apart today. The economic and ideological architecture that makes poverty appear inevitable even as global wealth multiplies. He will challenge us to move from growth without justice to growth through justice. Among all this gloom and doom, we have some good news to share as well. From Spain, muchísimas gracias. We have the Sevilla commitment. And here in The Hague, we have the ICG climate advisory. Haile Vedank. The similar commitment reform that value addition must begin at origin, that those who grow and make must also share the wealth they generate. And in the ICJ Climate Advisory Opinion delivered in The Hague, affirmed that climate finance and technology transfer to vulnerable nations are legal obligations, not acts of charity. Together, these two milestones give us both a moral compass and a legal mandate to restore fairness in trade and responsibility in stewardship. Here in the CFC, we are trying to do little bit of what we preach. At the Common Fund of Commodities, we believe that eradicating poverty is within reach if we humanize value chains and ensure justice in every transaction. From Benin to Colombia, from Zimbabwe to the Philippines, from Uganda to Kenya, Nigeria, Bangladesh, or even Afghanistan, the impact of the CFC is tangible. Through the projects such as the Tolaro Global Cashew Factory in Benin, the Organic Africa Initiative in Zimbabwe, the Supply Chain Financing Facility in East Africa, the Irrigated Perfumed Rice Project in Senegal, we are proving that inclusive investment can turn poverty into prosperity. Across continent, women, youth, men are finding decent jobs, fairer incomes, and renewed dignity because of CFC investment. Cooperatives are transforming into entire communities into zones of entrepreneurship, where smallholders once trapped in subsistence now own shares in local enterprises, value at origin, and lead climate resilient innovations. Each success story, either in a cashew plant or a rice field or a rural workshop, reinforces a single truth. When we invest in people, not pity, in fairness, not extraction, prosperity follows. Every cup of coffee, every bar of chocolate, every garment can become a vote for fairness and dignity. As consumers, investors, policymakers, we each hold that power. By seeking justice in every transaction, we can transform supply chains into lifelines and markets into instruments of equity. Let us also remember, we have only one Mother Earth. A system that impoverishes her stewards cannot protect her soil, forest, or biodiversity. Ending poverty and ensuring planetary security are two sides of the same moral coin. So today, as we commemorate the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, let us move beyond sympathy to solidarity, beyond charity to justice. The framework EUDR CS3D DPP shows that global north is awakening. Our task is to make the ground ready so that these policies empower smallholders instead of excluding them. Let us choose justice, let us choose action, let us humanize value chain, empower smallholders, and ensure that prosperity, equality, parity, and fairness grew from the same soil. The soil that sustains us all, from which both peace and dignity must rise. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your introduction. I would like now to ask my team to show us a very short video that will set the scene for us.
Across the globe, smallholder farmers form the backbone of the agricultural sector. They nurture the land, sow the seeds, and harvest the crops that feed the world. Yet these farmers face an unfair reality. What they receive at the farm gate is often just a fraction of what their labor is truly worth. A stark disparity between farm gate prices and the final retail price reveals a broken system. The hard-earned fruits of their labor are often undervalued, leaving millions of farmers trapped in cycles of poverty. The Common Fund for Commodities is committed to changing this narrative. By investing in sustainable agricultural practices, improving market access, and supporting value-added processes, we're working to empower farmers and close the gap in the value chain. Demand for our services is stronger than ever. To meet this overwhelming demand, we are mobilizing new resources. Our Agricultural Commodity Transformation Fund connects seed financing from the CFC with private sector impact investment and aims to increase vital support we can provide. Our investments are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and help target poverty eradication, food security, gender equality, and sustainable economic growth. We are humanizing the value chain, ensuring that the benefits flow back to those who deserve them most. Together, we can reduce inequality, empower farmers, and build a future where no one is left behind. Poverty ends when opportunity begins. Let's build those opportunities together. Join us in transforming the agricultural value chain. Together, we can eradicate poverty, empower farmers, and create lasting change. Invest in a sustainable future. Invest with CFC.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed. Next, I'm pleased to invite Dr. Andrew Fischer to give his presentation. Just a few words for the professor. Professor Andrew Fischer is a professor of inequality, social protection, and development at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, the Netherlands, and editorial chair of the journal Development and Change. His 2018 book, Poverty as Ideology, was awarded the International Studies in Poverty Prize by the Comparative Research Program on Poverty Crop and Z Books. Trained in demography and development economics, Mr. Fischer works extensively on poverty, inequality, social policy, and international development. He earned his PhD in development studies from the London School of Economics for his research on China's regional development strategies in Western China and their impact on ethnic minorities. He has been involved in the field of international development for over 30 years, with experience spanning across Latin America, Africa, and especially Asia, where he spent 7 years in India and Nepal prior to his PhD and 2 years in Western China. Parallel to his ongoing work on China, he's currently focusing on the interactions of redistribution with finance and production in development. And the theme of his presentation is structural drivers undermining the earnings of smallholder producers in the global south, revisiting the lessons of Arthur Lewis on the subsistence foundations of economic justice. Professor Fischer, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. And here, I'll just quickly share my PowerPoint. Do you all see that? Is that good?
Yes, it's perfect.
And is it full screen or is it? Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction and also for inviting me. I'm very honored and humbled to share whatever I can with you and the wonderful work you're doing as well. I've gotten to know the organization a bit now through our various encounters, and I'm quite impressed with what you do, with what you're doing and the ideas you have. And it's only through you're only limited by the resources that are available to you, but otherwise you have lots of wonderful ideas for addressing these issues. So I'm really honored to be here and that you entrust me to this task of speaking for the next, I guess, half hour. And obviously I'm an academic, so I'll get perhaps a bit more theoretical. Ambassador Bilal obviously invited me to, when he initially invited me, he wanted me to talk about this fundamental question of why smallholder farmers and commodity producers continue to receive low value for their produce, and how that's a fundamental driver of poverty. And so I was hoping I'd be able to shed some light on that issue from my perspective. So I'll try to do that by basically reviewing some of the main arguments around what drives this continual undervaluing of of labor in commodity production in the global south. And that's where I'd bring in some of the ideas of Arthur Lewis, partly because I've been working on that recently, and also because I think it is actually really valuable to revisit some of the things he was saying already now 70 years ago, and yet they're still relevant today, which is really the crazy thing. But I think the today core idea in my book that was mentioned, Poverty as Ideology, is very much around this idea that we've seen a transformation in the nature of modern poverty over, say, the last 100 years and so, which I feel is a core argument in my book, is that the current conventional measures of poverty do not capture this transformation of modern poverty very well. They miss a lot of it, essentially. I won't go further into that argument in this lecture, but just to say that, you know, in the past, if you were thinking about poverty perhaps 100 years, 150 years ago, you would have measured poverty basically through the price of food, which more or less determined the price of real wages. And we would think about poverty in terms of, even though there were distributional issues involved, it was very much about the insufficiency of supply, the insufficiency of production, the insufficiency of food. And then how to deal with that, right? Whereas we're living in a world today where there's just an abundance of output. The world is producing more per person than it's ever produced before in the history of the planet. Many, many times more. Actual physical output of products has increased many times more than the global population, and that includes food as well. So we produce more than enough food to feed the world's population, and yet, as Ambassador Bilal was saying in his introduction, there's still hundreds of millions of people, or possibly over 1 billion, who still go hungry. So what we're looking at in this modern era is much more of poverty is expressed more as a state of scarcity or austerity, even in a context, in a sort of macro context of abundance. And so how then do we conceptualize poverty in that way, and how do our measures of poverty then need to reflect that in a sense? Particularly as well as when you have a lot of very rapid transformations happening in the world economy that change the consumption basket of poor people, even poor people who, you know, 20, 30 years ago, having a mobile phone would have been, you know, an extremely unusual sort of possession, whereas today it's the availability of, you know, cheap phones and the need for phones to even be linked into the economic system means that now mobile phones are quite ubiquitous, so to speak, even among poor people, right? And hence that changes even the nature of their consumption needs in terms of what they need to spend their money on and so on. And also in the context of urbanization, where there's a lot more non-food but essential spending that poor people need to do. And hence the one thing that they can squeeze is food and what they eat. And hence you see, even as our measures of income poverty are falling, we see levels of malnutrition staying stubbornly very high. And so there's an increasing discrepancy between the typical World Bank $1, $2, $3 a day poverty lines and measures of malnutrition in the context of these transformations. So my book goes into that into a lot of detail. But today I wanted to, on the invitation of Ambassador Bilal, to talk more about what are some of these underlying structural drivers that undermine the value of labor in this context, because we really need to think of, I mean, we can think simplistically in terms of how poverty is a reflection of somebody's productivity, how much value they're producing, and how that value is measured in monetary terms to become their income. But that has to be understood within an economic system, of course, where most developing countries today are very open, completely open to the world economy. and hence their incomes and their consumption is influenced by the world economy. And hence it's in the interaction of a very unequal economic system that we have to understand how poverty is then reproduced, right? So a lot of the classic arguments around, from that perspective, a lot of the classic arguments, of course, around what was undermining the earnings, say, of small farmers in, shall we say, developing countries, global south, or whichever term, low and middle income countries, was what we referred to, of course, as the terms of trade, right? And this was some of the classic theories that really opened the field of development economics, was by people like Raoul Prebisch and Hans Singer and others, was this argument that there was a long-term declining trend in the terms of trade of agricultural prices vis-a-vis manufactured goods, for instance, or services, other types of goods, which essentially means, and this is, you see, it's from an article that's already from 12 years ago, but nonetheless, it was measuring historically the trends of agricultural prices on average, right? So it's averaging out all agricultural prices over the last, 1900 to 2010. And you see, despite some ups and downs, this consistent downward trend in the prices. So even if you look at the very end around 2008-9, when we had this spike in food prices that created a bit of a panic, even those spikes were very low relative to where food prices were at. The terms of trade of food prices vis-a-vis other goods were at, say, in the 1950s. Now, what terms of trade is essentially measuring is the purchasing power of the agricultural products to buy the other, manufactured goods and services, right? So it's typically measured against manufactured goods. So it's basically the inverse of this is the rising terms of trade of manufactured goods. So basically what's happening is that even the output that commodity producers or food producers are producing per unit of output buys less and less and less of manufactured goods consumption. So even if your productivity is stable or you're even increasing your productivity, you can buy less and less with that. And so that's constantly undermining the position of developing countries and particularly of commodity producers. Particularly if you're a small farmer and you're very limited in terms of how much you can then, in response to the declining terms of trade, increase your scale of production, right? Because of limited land or lack of capital to invest in capitalizing agriculture and so on. And I mean, this is a classic argument, but I mean, I think it's important to emphasize because it's still ongoing today, right? As we see here, the spike in prices at the 2008, just before 2008, the financial crisis was relatively low. And you see this, in the early part of the century before right up to the First World War was the classic period where, Argentina was booming, for instance, because you could get rich on exporting wheat and meat, basically to industrializing Europe, when that collapsed following the First World War. And that really is what set off a lot of the original thinkers around development economics to say, okay, well, commodity trade can no longer drive our economic growth. We need to industrialize and we need to protect our economies and move to different types of models, right? Which, of course, as we know the whole history, in the 80s, what is referred to as sort of the neoliberal period, or counter-revolution, if you wish, swept a lot of that aside, except in India and China, perhaps, although eventually India as well liberalized. So, but if we look at individual commodities as well, we see this problem that this is coffee prices. So this is looking at coffee prices from, say, 1970 to 2025. And we see this classic problem here. I mean, don't forget, this is the previous one was measuring agricultural prices to manufactured goods. So it's already relativized in that sense. Here we're looking at just nominal prices. So even though the price in 2025 is higher than, say, in 1975, during that period, the prices might have increased. Overall, general price levels would have doubled, tripled, or quadrupled. So actually, the $4 today is worth probably much less than what it was worth in 1970, 50 cents or a dollar in that sense. Um, um, but what you see, for instance, is this problem, again, what Keynes originally, John Maynard Keynes referred to and was really picked up in the early period of development economics, is this idea of the fallacy of composition, which is the problem with commodities, of course, is they're very competitive, easily substitutable goods, but that have very low barriers of entry, unlike, say, advanced manufacturing, and which is more oligopolistic, and which means that if everyone piles in and invests, say, in increasing coffee production, then there's an increase in supply of coffee, and then prices fall. And so you're, in the end, even though you've increased your supply of coffee, you're receiving less for it, and you're none the better, except you've lost all your investment into increasing coffee production, right? And this is exactly what we saw following the peak in coffee prices in the late 70s, and particularly in the 80s, when there was a big, huge economic crisis. And then what did the World Bank say? The World Bank said export. So there's this whole ethos of exporting. Look at Korea. Korea's exporting. So export whatever you can. Just grab it and export it, so to speak. Obviously, in coffee, it takes 5 years to actually increase your exports because it takes 5 years for a coffee plant to mature to start producing. But then as everyone invests to increase their coffee production, then prices collapse, which is what you see happening from the mid 80s to the mid 90s, roughly. And then you had a correction. Some of that might have been due to weather and so on. But again, what happened is, for instance, Vietnam in the 90s was sort of a planned introduction of coffee as one of their export commodities, and just came on board. I forget what the numbers was, but it was like a huge amount of land, like 500,000 hectares of land, which suddenly came onto the world market in the mid 90s with a huge supply once all these coffee plants matured and started producing, which again caused the collapse in coffee prices, which you see from 95 to 2000. And so you'll have short spikes afterwards, but generally speaking, you're always on kind of a, you're running to catch up. You're investing more and more in coffee prices, but basically the value of your coffee is buying you less and less and less of the goods you need to buy from the rest of the world, manufactured goods in particular, and also services. So these are some of the classic issues that we used to talk a lot about, and are still very much relevant, right? That are constantly undermining commodity producers in that sense, non-oil commodity producers. If I can also, the other issue, of course, and this was really flagged by what we call structuralist economists or dependency theory, was obviously the control of the value chains, right, by transnational corporations, obviously. So, and this is, I think, where if I've, with the permission from the CFC, I've borrowed a few of their own slides because I think the slides demonstrate this very well. Did I? Wait, did I show you? Oh, this was the. This was just the coffee prices in a more, but I'll just jump over that. So what we see here in this slide, for instance, is all these commodities, export commodities, right? Besides maybe soybeans and wheat, which will also be consumed, and rice, which will be consumed domestically, but maize, well, anyways. Where the actual the actual value of the raw product is only a small proportion of the total value after primary and secondary processing. And I believe, if I understand, this doesn't even include the retail sale, right? This is just the primary and secondary processing. So obviously the big question there is who controls the primary and secondary processing, right? And it's obviously a lot of that is controlled by a lot of these major oligopolistic, meaning there's only a few of them dominating the market, who extract a lot of the value, right? And that's where the issue of unequal exchange, which you mentioned, Jason Hickel, comes in. because it's the idea then where, how much are these big transnational firms exploiting the farmers, pushing down that value to maximize all of the rest, right? And yeah, I mean, there's various ways to try and measure that or detect it and so on, but that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about unequal exchange. I mean, two other slides that they had, one on the cost breakdown of the T-shirt, of course, is a very nice one as well. I enjoyed this one. They took it obviously from clean clothes campaigns, but it shows the yellow and the red are being the two areas absorbing 59, 60, yeah, close to 3/4 of the value of the final value of the good, right? Is in the retail and the profit to the brand. There's some going to material costs, which of course is not value added, transport costs, which would be going to intermediaries, but very little going to even the factory in Bangladesh, although interestingly, the factory is still getting a lot more than what the worker gets, right? So there's an issue there also about the division between the profits and wages, even in Bangladesh itself, being very unequal, right? And we see the same thing. I mean, I remember this graphic when it came out in the Financial Times because I tweeted it. It was a great graphic. And again, what we see here is that on the left-hand side, the profit, the tax, the staff, and the shop rent. So the staff is essentially the labor costs, but in the global north, absorb, I'm not sure how much that is, but it's a huge proportion, perhaps 80 to 90% or more of the value that's, see, the value of the $2.50 cup, which is quite optimistic because these days you'd probably pay, what, £4 for it or something. In the UK, is the most of it is captured by that value there. This is where I would make maybe I mean, academics always criticize each other, so excuse me for, I'd make some criticism of Jason Hickel, because what he is suggesting is that this is an unequal trade, whereas I don't think this is necessarily unequal trade, because what it's reflecting is it's largely reflecting, besides the profit component, it's largely reflecting the costs and the wages in the rich countries, right? So you take your coffee, you take it to the UK or to Belgium or Netherlands, and you sell a coffee in a cafe in Netherlands. It's not that you're making the profit from the 1 cent you spent on the coffee bean to the €4 you spent on the cup of coffee. It's the fact that setting up the coffee shop, rents are high, labor, you have to pay them, I don't know what you'd pay them now in a coffee shop, 15 an hour. And then of course the taxes are Dutch taxes, and so on. So it's reflective of the cost of living and this level of wages in the places where the product is sold, more than necessarily representing sort of unequal exchange in that sense. In the sense that if this cup of coffee would be sold in India, it would be sold maybe for 25, 50 cents, and then that share would be much less, and it would be reflecting the lower cost of staff, the lower cost of rent, and taxes, and so on. Yeah, so I mean, I think that, but I think this is also important. It's important because it's not necessarily, as I said, indicating unequal exchange so much as it's a reflection of industrialization, right? Particularly industrialization, where you're at the sort of cutting edge of industrialization. Industrialization being moving up, capturing more of the value added in goods through industrial processes, and also diversifying into other products and goods and so on. And essentially what we see is the rich countries are advanced industrial countries, and so they have a high level of productivity that sustains these costs and these wages and these profits and these taxes and so on. Now, it's a value added, the value extracted from an equal trade adds to that, and boost that, although there's a lot of debates on how much that's actually adding to the overall level of productivity. But the reality is that, the global north, so to speak, these costs are reflective of these high levels of income that are structurally founded on high levels of productivity and high levels of industrialization. And a lot of these costs here as well, in the staff and the shop and rent, are not even in manufacturing, they're in services. So there's the typical observation that services are more expensive in the global north. And so a lot of what we see in these value distributions are reflecting the high cost of services in the global north. Why are services expensive in the global north? Again, it's because of the history of industrialization, right? In that sense. So in the dilemma for global south countries in that sense is to keep up with to these levels of industrialization, these levels of productivity. I say productivity with some caution because productivity, as I've written about, is a difficult concept to measure, and we measure it as a proxy through value added terms. So if we use value added, that includes wages, and that means if there's the same work is done by somebody in the global south for a much lower wage, that appears to be less productive because it has a lower value added. So we have to be careful in that sense. But that being said, the global north are the industrial leaders. Well, now with China catching up and competing with them. So in that context, the global south countries are always like running to catch up in a sense. You can take examples, for instance, like in farming, where as farming here in the Netherlands, it's crazy if you see agriculture in the Netherlands. It's so incredibly capital intensive now. It's to visit some of these greenhouses or farms or farm auctions and so on, or my country, I'm Canadian. The vast scale of farms and the capital intensity of farms means that you have a very, very high labor productivity in farming, even measured in physical terms, like wheat produced per worker, for instance, right? Or vegetables produced per worker, so measured even purely in physical terms, where you remove the value, right? And so the effect of increasing productivity is one of the effects is it lowers the unit costs of output, right? So the output per unit of output becomes cheaper and cheaper. We see that in textiles, for instance. So if we saw the shirt that we saw before, it was $29 for the shirt. So, as you have manufacturing advancing and getting more and more capital intensive manufacturing of textiles, a huge, in this case, dominated by China, I was observing in China 20 years ago, factories in the west of China with workers with very low wages, but they were entirely automized factories running with machinery bought from Germany and Japan, for instance. And the workers were just making sure that the machines weren't getting tangled up, but the whole process was extremely, extremely productive in terms of physical output of textile, right? So the effect of that, especially if you're dealing with a competitive good like textiles, is that it brings down the unit costs of output. But if you're then a small scale producer in food or textiles or something else, and you don't have the ability to buy those machines or increase, to match that productivity increase, the only way you can compensate is essentially by competing on wages, right? So it brings this constant pressure for the ones who are working with older technologies, older techniques of production, to constantly compete by lowering their wages. So that's where you get this sort of structural push for those that aren't able to catch up and industrialize, for a downward pressure on wages. Right? You might say it's part of the capitalist process. You see that in food as well, although it's not necessarily expressed by wages. But if we look at, even though, they always say, like you said earlier, Ambassador Bilal, about how small farmers produce most of the world's food, but a lot of that's then consumed themselves, right? Whereas the surplus food that's produced and then sold on world markets that determines food prices is for the large part produced by these massive capital intensive farms in North America, Europe, Russia, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And so they set the price for the agricultural goods. And the increasing productivity also has this effect, as I showed in the first slide, of lowering the terms of trade for the food output, even in something like wheats, which the capital intensive farmers adjust to by increasing their productivity if they can, or a lot of them go out of business because even them, they're often running on very thin margins and a bad season can bankrupt them. But the small farmer who is limited in their land and has no capital to buy a tractor, but even if they would buy a tractor, what's the point of it? Because they have a limited amount of land. They still have the output that they have. They can become more productive, but it's limited how much they can increase their labor productivity. And in that context, the effect is that their earnings fall because they're getting less and less because of the declining terms of trade, right? So this is sort of the dynamic interaction in the international economy by which you have this constant downward pressure on the wages of the small producers in the global South, right? So that was one major point I wanted to make. And in that sense, we always have to see everything as relative and interacting in a relationship with each other. We could say it's relational, but it's relative in the sense that it's all relative to the interactions in the system as a whole, right? And in the example I just gave of poor farmers earning less and less and less from their surplus output, the limited surplus output they might produce on a farm in the South, I would be uncomfortable calling that extraction or unequal exchange, but it's more of a structural outcome of the interaction in the system in that sense. Now, that being said, all I've been saying now doesn't explain situations like, for instance, recently cocoa prices, for instance, went through the roof. And I was discussing this the other day with Ambassador Bilal. And even though cocoa prices went through the roof, cocoa farmers in Ghana, for instance, weren't really benefiting much from the increased prices in cocoa. Now, there could be a lot of different institutional reasons for that and so on. It's partly because the way the cocoa value chain is controlled by large, transnational corporations. It might also be then also commodity boards in Ghana itself. And this is where I think the work of CFC is. I'm really impressed by the way they're thinking through this and thinking about, how do we get more money down to actually the small farmers in that sense to increase their wages, and how small of a contribution at the top end of this value chain can make to the farmer in terms of bringing them out of poverty in that sense. And one of the questions that Ambassador Bilal had for me, he sent to me earlier today, was, would this be enough to compensate for this? Or would it just be feeding back into a system? I mean, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but it is true that even if you could improve their incomes through innovative ways of transferring funds from consumers in a sort of solidaristic manner to the producers, in the short term, it could produce, strong improvements. But in the dynamic interactions of the system and how it's changing radically over time, because the technological frontier is galloping ahead as we speak, right, with AI and everything. And this is even transforming agriculture and agricultural markets and so on. That the problem is that these benefits could be then lost through relative values very quickly as those relative values adjust, right? So it could be a short-term benefit, but we still need to think about what's then the long-term strategy to maintain those benefits, right? And there, I think all of these arguments consistently point to, as they did for the original classical development economists from the South, like Arthur Lewis and Raoul Prebisch and others, back to the issue of industrialization. Because what we're really looking at here, as I said, with this value chain in coffee, it's what we're really looking at here is the effects, the outcomes of the industrialization process, right? And again, as I said, industrialization, exactly as Ambassador Bilal said in the beginning, it's really focused on how do you capture more of the value added locally. So create more of the value added locally, and also, the value added that's already in the chain because it's already there. So you have to figure out how to capture more of the chain and bring it locally, but also diversifying into different types of products, right? And also, I would also emphasize to that, it's not just about that, but it's also about national control, domestic control over the value chain as well, which I think is very incredibly important. This is where I think the structuralists in early development economics were very strong. They were putting a lot of emphasis on the negative impacts of this dominance of transnational corporations as they were expanding into developing countries in that sense, and the way they control the chain, squeeze the bottom of the chain, capture the value, and they don't reinvest it into the economy and so on. If you look at successful cases like South Korea, China, whatever, they put a huge emphasis on the national ownership of the industrialization process, right? Or the national ownership of this process of capturing more of the value chain locally, right? If we want to put it in those terms. But there's also, that being said, there's also an important cautionary point to make, which is that the terms of trade dynamics that we see in agricultural commodities, we also see in manufacturing goods produced by the global south, right? Now, this is again what maybe Jason Hickel would refer to as unequal trade, but it's basically reflecting that as the global south has moved into manufacturing exports in a really big way, particularly East Asia and Southeast Asia, since the 1970s. The manufacturing products that they're exporting have been behaving more and more like agricultural goods, right? And this is, I mean, I think this is backed up by the research by Bill Urton, for instance. A very interesting paper that came out, well, now again, 14 years ago. I've been looking at her recent work. She unfortunately hasn't updated it. But it's, I mean, we can think of the example of textiles in Bangladesh, which would be reported as manufacturers that we were referring to earlier, and where they move into the manufacturing exports of textiles, but of course, there's this constant the value chain of textiles is dominated by the north and controlled by the north, and then there's always this pressure on basically what the Bangladeshi textile producers actually earn, right? Which I think CFC has documented quite extensively in that sense. But you can also see it in, I mean, this isn't just Bangladesh textile production. You also see it in the terms of trade of Chinese exports, for instance. There's a lot of really good research that might have changed slightly in recent years as China has been moving more and more into also itself capturing more local value added and competing in more of the high tech sectors. But definitely up to 2010, 2015, China had a big major problem where a lot of its manufactured exports were basically the processing of imported inputs based with very thin margins and low wages, and hence the value added they were getting from it was quite low. And the prices of those manufacturers that they were exporting was being squeezed by the international value chains or production networks that were controlling the production process, right? So again, would you call this unequal exchange or would you call it something else? I'm not sure, but it's an interesting point. It would be unequal exchange if you maybe look at textiles. A Bangladeshi textile worker, in terms of shirts produced per hour or day, is probably as productive, if not more productive, than a textile worker in the US. And yet the textile worker in the US probably earns 10, 20, 30 times more than the textile worker in Bangladesh, right? For the exact same product, right? If you can put it in those terms, then maybe then you can say it's unequal exchange, right? But if you're talking about Apple controlling the international production network of an iPhone, it's trickier because the goods that are being exchanged are different, right? So, China might be assembling the iPhone, and yet a lot of the most important high-tech components of the iPhone are still developed and controlled by Apple in the US in that sense. And so you're comparing apples and oranges if you try and then compare the value of products in that sense. But it's just to raise this point that even moving into manufacturing exports has this underlying problem, right? And what's interesting, and this brings me to Lewis, if I haven't spent too much time already, I don't know how much time you want me to speak. Oh my gosh, I think we only had 2 hours, right? But it brings me to Lewis, because Lewis actually predicted this, probably as early as 1954, but definitely in 1977. He predicted that as developing countries would move into manufacturing exports, this type of thing would happen. And the reason he explained it is because he was basically arguing that the wages were not being determined by the productivity of the industry itself. They were determined by the general subsistence conditions of the economy in general and the productivity levels, particularly in food production for local consumption. So the regular farmers and peasants who are producing food for people in that country, right? And I mean, this is just a famous quote from his article. He says, take for the example, and I think Lewis is massively understood in this because people only think of him he's often characterized as diminishing the role of agriculture and only emphasizing industry. And it was quite the opposite, actually. For him, he felt that the solution for this situation was to increase the productivity of farmers producing food for the domestic market, right, for domestic consumption. And what he argued was that if you don't do that, efforts to increase productivity in the exports to rich countries will just result in falling prices, right? And then the benefits of increasing productivity will be lost to the north, right? So he was trying to identify a much more underlying structural factor in the interaction between the global north and the global south that was producing this type of outcome without saying it was due to exploitation or without saying I mean, obviously more radical people were critical of him because he wasn't saying it was all to imperial practices and so on. But he gave the example of sugar here, for instance, where the sugar industry was increased productivity massively in the 75 years up to when he was writing, and yet the wages in the sugar industry were very, very low, right? And poverty level wages, whereas in the wheat industry in North America they were high. Part of that is because this asymmetry in the international economic system, where in the global north there there wasn't necessarily an abundance of labor. And also they were, industrialized and controlling industries, and hence they could, if you had rising productivity, they could capture that rising productivity in wages or profits. Whereas most of the global south had the condition of what he referred to as unlimited supplies of labor. And what he simply meant by that was, if we take the Bangladeshi example, a slide I haven't shown here, but that Ambassador Bilal showed me the other day. For instance, the wages in Bangladesh, minimum wages in the garment industry in Bangladesh are $113 equivalent in 2023. As long as you have more people willing to work at that wage than employers are willing to employ. So there's a surplus of workers for whatever the industry needs because of conditions of poverty and so on. Wages will stay at that level. I mean, they might change, but in real terms, they'll stay at that level, and they'll certainly stay at that level relative to international prices and so on. So that the interaction between the global north and the global south, given their different structural conditions, is such that the wages will always be driven down to what he called subsistence levels in the global south, while all the benefits of increasing productivity were being captured by the global north. And for him, the only way to really address this was by investing and bringing up productivity in the subsistence sector. So what he was basically saying is that it wasn't, well, yeah, I have fancy academic terms here. I don't have time to go into them because I think I'm running out of time. I'm receiving messages which aren't from you. Okay, that's good. But he was basically saying that I've already referred to these points, is that that the prices of tropical commercial crops will always permit only a subsistence wage until, for a change, capital and knowledge are put at the disposal of subsistence producers to increase the productivity of tropical food production for home consumption. Right? So it's a very, very different vision of what needs to be done than the way he's usually portrayed. But also, most of the focus we have is, okay, how do we increase the productivity of, say, coffee farmers so they produce more coffee to export abroad, right? But the problem is that you do that in an ocean of labor supply where the levels of subsistence, so to speak, are quite low, and hence the supply of labor going into these various sectors is having quite of a low sort of wage expectation in a sense, right? Or earnings expectation. And so there's always this tendency in that context, in an open economy setting where you're interacting with the global north, for the pressure to just push the wages or earnings back down to that subsistence level and to extract off whatever else can be taken above that subsistence level. And I think a great way to, if I have a few more minutes, do I have a few more minutes, or I always like to refer to.
Shall we say 15 seconds?
15 seconds. A PhD student of mine who did the wonderful research on this, but actually in gold production, and he was comparing the industrial gold mining in DRC with artisanal gold mining in DRC. And just to cut a long story short, the interesting thing is that even though the industrial mines were like 25 times more productive than the artisanal miners, the wages of the average worker in the industrial mines was no different from the earnings of the typical artisanal miner, because basically the wages are being pushed down to the norm of the local economy, which is determined by the productivity of local subsistence conditions. And in that context, then the international, in this case, a Canadian mining company, just all the rest goes to managers and profits abroad and so on, right? So this is this fundamental dynamic that you see across sectors in the global south that are integrated in this way. So I have to stop there because I've been told I think I used up my 15 seconds. But it's just as the last point on Lewis on economic justice, this is what he said was, as he said, it is in this fundamental sense in which the leaders of the less developed world denounce the current international economic order as unjust, namely that the factorial terms of trade are based on market forces of opportunity cost, basically how low can you pay somebody, and not on the just principle of equal pay for equal work, right? And then the other quote, which I'll let you read on your own, is just his vision of how to get out of this, right? So I'll leave it there. I hope that.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting, and I think actually it connects really well with what one of our seasoned members of our technical assistance team, Mrs. Paula White, would like to present to us. Paula, can you give us in 1 minute some general insights on the projects you're working on?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
We can hear you perfectly.
Great. Okay, I'm going to try and keep this really brief then. I'm aware we're over time. So my name is Paula White. I work at the CFC as part of the TA team. We provide TA services for external impact funds. One of these is the African Agriculture and Trade Investment Fund, otherwise known as ATIF. And today I'll just give a very brief example from that TA facility, showing how we support both agri SMEs and smallholder livelihoods through TA. So I'll do this through 5 key points. Sarah, could you maybe jump to the next slide? Thanks. So my first point, who is the agri SME and what does our engagement look like? So the company that I will talk about is called African Milling Limited, AML. It's a family-owned maize and wheat processor based in Zambia. So AML sources wheat from its own and nearby commercial farms, but depends heavily on smallholder farmers for maize. So thousands of families whose income and food security rely on this value chain. So ATIF partnered with AML since 2018, providing USD 15 million in working capital. And then with the TA facility, we've complemented this with targeted non-financial support to strengthen AML's environmental and social management, diversify its product offering, and improve its relationship with smallholder suppliers. Okay, this brings me to my next point. What is the challenge then that we came in to address with the TA support? So after AML expanded its milling capacity, it faced challenges in securing enough maize. So Zambia's maize market is highly competitive, and side selling, where farmers sell to the highest bidder, has made consistent sourcing really difficult. But at the same time, we have climate change, which has become a major threat. Zambia has experienced recurrent droughts, erratic rainfall. Particularly last year, it was really bad, severely affecting maize yields and thus farmer incomes as well. So for smallholders already living close to the poverty line, these climate shocks can really wipe out an entire season's income. Okay, so this brings me to my third point. How have we approached it through TA? So to stabilize the supply while ensuring smallholder farmers could benefit more from the value chain, the TA facility first supported the company back in 2021 to develop a sustainable maize sourcing strategy. The goals here were really twofold. First one was to optimize AML's internal capacity, and the second one was to enable smallholders to increase maize yields and their income sustainably. So while the first component was successfully adopted by the company, the more inwards-looking part of the TA, the side selling and the competitive market that is the maize value chain have made it very difficult to invest directly at the farmer level by the company. And I mean, this is just prevalent, I think, with maize. So therefore, this brings me to last year, 2024. We've been, since 2021, in discussions with the company who really were keen to have a relationship with farmers, but were unsure how. We've shifted this focus to empowering farmer cooperatives and farmer groups instead. So this is a model that builds collective strength and reduces vulnerability. So through a pilot project, we have supported 11 cooperatives, including 600 smallholder farmers, of which 50% are women, to improve leadership, cooperative management, governance, financial literacy, marketing, input extension services, etc. So that's really what we did. This brings me then to my fourth point, which is really the results and what can this lead to in the future. So we're awaiting the results of this year's harvest to confirm really the success of this initiative. However, initial feedback from both the company and the cooperatives has been really positive. The company is eager to deepen its engagement through offtake agreements and by collaborating with additional cooperatives should the initiative prove commercially viable following this buying season, which is currently ongoing. So by strengthening these farmer organizations, we're helping smallholders move from subsistence level farming to becoming reliable business partners, able to access credit, negotiate better prices, secure long-term offtake agreements. The training also strengthened linkages with the company, helping shift from a transactional relationship with individual farmers to a trust-based partnership with cooperatives, forming the basis of a sustainable sourcing model. So this is really a win-win for both the company and the farmers. Sustainable sourcing through cooperative relationships offers a strong business model for the company to grow its revenues, processing output, market share, but it also relies on key success factors such as improving the cooperative's access to markets, direct input supply, and establishing offtake agreements. So in short, by supporting the farmers, by supporting the cooperatives, this can lead to a benefit for the company in the long run. So point number 5, and this is really where I wrap up, how this example links directly to poverty eradication, given the theme of today's webinar. It demonstrates that when impact capital and targeted TA come together, they can create inclusive, sustainable pathways out of poverty through stronger market participation and fairer economic opportunities. While the next harvest is going to be what determines the financial results, the approach is already showing how empowering smallholders collectively can lead to more stable incomes, improved food security, and greater resilience. So these are all key steps towards ending rural poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. So I believe now what we need is a connection between theory, practice from Paula, and who can do that better rather than our managing director? Maybe, Your Excellency, you can give us a nice closing remark providing this connection.
No, thank you, Professor Fischer and Paula. Thank you, thank you. I think, yeah, as our Chris said, I think the theory and practice. So in this one a small program, the project that we have shown, where we kind of brought together all those dispersed units of productions into one cooperatives, and thereby giving them, injecting into them some kind of economy of a scale, and that bring us close to what this industrial plantations and other big multinationals are doing in their own way. So I believe that this is what CFC is, this is what we try to do, and the combination of fund and technical assistance is something so unique and so vastly needed, but so little in supply. I know that in this discussion there are people who can make a difference, who can make us break free from this kind of an drought of resources, because there's already there, and you can see this example where you can bring this people, disperse people, and to bring into something that's unthinkable. And the power of cooperatives, we can give you innumerable projects where we can show you that how it can work wonders if you can manage it well. And I came to see now that mainly young generations who are coming with the latest knowledge from different kind of countries, like maybe ISS students and others, when they go back home, when they go engaged into this kind of agripreneurial job, I think they can bring wonderful. We have we usually have enough time to show you the example of Jackie Sisi in Uganda. Jackie Sisi means just know your coffee cup. Within a few years, the farmers who were selling these things at a truer prices, and they have been brought together in a cooperative, the value of that company gone from 24 million to 78 million, like this. So we would like to see and to tell the people that no matter how we bargain and debate, as Professor, you have a little bit some reservation about the Jackson Hickel, but the problem is that we are not going to bog down into this theory. We just want to deliver our result and impacts. And that's why this project that my colleague shows in Zambia, and I told about the Uganda and many others, that's where I think we can make a difference. So those of you who are listening to this, when you go back home, just think that if you can be a part of this project like Zambia Mailing or JACCC, you will have a very good night's sleep. Thank you. Back to
Thank
you.
you
Back
very
to you.
much for this very rounded remark. And I would like to thank all of our speakers for their time and also the interesting ideas they presented to us today. We hope that this conversation was also interesting for everyone in the webinar, and we hope we can work all together to advance economic justice in the future for our smallholder farmers. A recording of today's event will be, of course, be shared with you by email. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them to us, and we will be back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.